Joining me now is Cindy Blackstock. She is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, which began this legal process so long ago. Cindy Blackstock, first of all, I want to get your reaction. You began this on behalf of these Indigenous children who were through the system. What is your reaction to the decision today?
It is a complete win for kids and a total dismissal of all of Canada's spurious arguments. What was at issue here, Evan, is the #1 call to action on equity and child welfare and the #3 call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Jordan's Principle. This decision means that First Nations children off reserve can get the help they need to recover from the trauma of residential schools through Jordan's Principle. And it also means that Canada's many and ongoing victims of its discriminatory underfunding of children's services can get compensated to a value of $40,000 each.
Okay, first of all, how many kids would be eligible? Do we know?
Well, we don't know the exact number, but any year there's about 10,000 First Nations kids who have been separated from their families, and the vast majority of those children would be eligible for compensation.
Okay, the judgment, the federal government who took this case lost, as I've read the judgment, on almost every count. So what happens now? So what's the next step here? Because we don't know if the federal government's going to appeal or not. So what happens now?
Well, we wait to see whether they appeal on October 30th, but Canadians can take action tomorrow. I mean, Evan, this case is now 14 and a half years old. There's been about 28 judgments. Canada has lost all of them except for one that was overturned on appeal. What are we looking for? We want equitable and culturally based services for First Nations kids so they can recover from residential schools and live healthy lives. And that's what the federal government's fighting against. So Canadians, if they don't want this done in their name, tomorrow is the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Write your elected officials, say, drop all these legal challenges, obey the legal orders, and do the right thing.
If they do drop it, how would people then apply to get some compensation? Because one of the aspects is eligibility. Who's actually eligible? Yeah. Again, the government lost on every count. You didn't have to prove what happened to you. You didn't have to. But how fast could someone apply and maybe get compensated?
Well, if there is no appeal, then we've been doing a lot of work with Youth in Care Canada, with the Assembly of First Nations, and with other groups to make sure that we are as ready as possible to begin rolling this out as quickly as possible for families. So what we need, though, is for those appeals to stop. That really triggers us being able to get to the real work, which is ensuring people receive compensation, and not just compensation, but support services around that compensation.
Cindy Blackstock, one of the arguments that the federal government and Minister Mark Miller had said on this program and to Canadians is, look, the federal government is not opposed to compensating Indigenous children who are impacted by the child welfare system. But we don't like the Human Rights Tribunal's notion that every single person gets $40,000, which is the statutory maximum, by the way, because somebody who was in the system for a month might get the same compensation as someone who had a terrible experience for years, and so we think it should be more proportional. That didn't happen. What is your answer to them?
Well, the $40,000 is the floor. If the Prime Minister feels that children who are unnecessarily separated from their families due to really what amount to be apartheid levels of public service, or children who had died waiting to get public services that other children would otherwise be provided, is not worth $40,000, then how much does he think it's worth? You know, $40,000 should be the floor, and then they can compensate people for more than that.
Okay.
What I think is happening is that they actually want to compensate these kids less than the $40,000. They want to shuffle deck chairs on the Titanic, giving one child 40, maybe another child 10. That is untenable. Okay. And the court rejects that.
The court did reject that. So I want to just go over this clearly. The court said that every child, regardless of time and experience, because of the fundamental act of discrimination, will be eligible for the statutory maximum of $40,000, not less. But you're saying that that could be the floor, that there's nothing stopping the government of saying, you'll all get $40,000, but you can still be compensated more than that. Fair?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, we have a precedent for that. in the residential schools settlement, Evan, you'll remember there was something called the Common Experience Payment, which was everyone who went to residential school got that. And then there was an additional process for persons who were particularly harmed. So the $40,000 in human rights damages is the floor, and the federal government needs to build on top of that.
The question is, what's the framework? So let's say there is someone who said, okay, I'll take the floor, but I was in there for years, or my son or daughter died in the system, as you've talked about that.
Yeah.
They want more. Do they have to? It took you 14 years to do this. Like, what do you say to those families who say, okay, that's the floor, I'd like to be compensated more? There's no framework for awards. Do they have to go through this alone? What happens to those families?
Well, fortunately, there is a class action that's been filed already that is awaiting certification. And so that could be a pathway to getting that more and to having a process to get through that. And I would just really pray that every Canadian keeps an eagle eye on the government to make sure these survivors don't have to fight for this compensation. You know, Evan, when this decision came down in 2016, substantiating this racial discrimination against these kids, and we knew the Canadian Human Rights Act had that compensation component, I immediately reached out to the federal government. I said, look, make this the first generation of First Nations kids that doesn't have to fight you to get compensated for the harms you've done to them. Reach out in friendship and do the right thing, and they never did.
What is your message now to the minister as the government is considering whether or not to appeal right now, and what message would it send if they do appeal?
I would say you can't appeal this decision. Like, you have got to put your sword down. It's enough fighting this generation of First Nations kids. And if you do appeal, it means that whatever orange shirt you're wearing tomorrow is meaningless. Reconciliation can't be just a bunch of gestures. It has to be real change. And the government cannot say that it's doing reconciliation when it's actively fighting and hurting this generation of First Nations.
Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is going to be joining many people to try to honor, whether it's tonight or tomorrow, the very first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. But the decision on the appeal will not yet been done, Cindy Blackstock. What if he shows up at one of these events, as he will likely do, and in an act of solidarity when you don't have an answer on this case? What message will that send?
Well, I think the government could decide today that it's not going to appeal the decision, and I hope it does. And the other thing that the Prime Minister could do is stop litigating against survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. Evan, you'll remember that's a school where they would literally put children in straitjackets and then put them in an electric chair and shock them for amusement. They're fighting those people in court. Like, there's some key things that the government is doing that's harming people. And one of the greatest gifts that the Prime Minister or any elected official can do tomorrow is stop harming us. At least do that. And then let's work together on addressing the TRC calls to action.
Cindy Blackstock, 14-year battle, Cindy Blackstock, on behalf of so many children. For you, obviously, it's still not over, frankly, but it is a massive milestone. Thank you, Cindy. Always a pleasure to have you on the program.